Right then, Hollywood loves selling you a story, and in the 1950s and 60s, the story they loved selling most was the good book, grand. They'd splash 70mm of holy light across a screen as wide as a football field, hire thousands of extras, put a fella with a nice beard in a robe, and call it an epic. They want you to remember the reverence, the scale, the piety of it all. But the real story, the one with the carry-on, the one where they took the most famous story ever told and made an absolute hames of it, that's the good stuff.
Okay.
Come here to me, and I'll tell you about the film that was so colossally misjudged, so perfectly arrogant, that the wags in Hollywood didn't call it by its proper name. Oh no.
Oh no.
They nicknamed it I Was a Teenage Jesus. The year was 1961, and the studio, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, the big roaring lion, was on its last legs. It was bleeding money. The whole golden age was rotten. The empire was crashing down. Just 2 years before, in 1959, they'd had the biggest hit in human history, Ben-Hur. It won 11 Oscars. It made a mountain of money so tall it probably blocked out the sun. It saved the studio. For about 5 minutes. Like any good gambler who just hit the jackpot, MGM's first and only thought was, how do we do it again, but bigger?
I don't know.
They were desperate to repeat the trick, and what's bigger than Ben-Hur? Ben-Hur was just a story about a fella who meets Jesus. The lads at the studio thought, why bother with the side character? Let's do the main man himself. The plan, on paper, you couldn't fault it. They wouldn't even make it themselves. That was too much hassle. They'd finance and distribute it for an outside producer, a fella named Samuel Bronston. Now, Bronston was a yoke unto himself. A Romanian-born, Paris-educated operator, a showman, ahead the ball with a briefcase. He had a brilliant notion. Why spend a fortune building sets in Hollywood when you could go to Spain?
You're goddamn right.
Generalissimo Franco, the dictator running the gaff, was only too delighted to have Hollywood come and play. He'd rent you his army. You need 10,000 Roman soldiers? No bother. He'd give them to you for pennies on the dollar. You need a desert? Spain has loads of them. Bronston built his own personal Hollywood in the suburbs of Madrid. Massive studios, massive backlots. He was going to make epics bigger, wider, and cheaper than anyone else. So MGM gives this gombeen a mountain of cash. The budget was $6 million, which of course swelled to $8 million before they were done, a budget big enough to choke a donkey. And for this masterpiece, this definitive life of Christ, they needed a top-shelf director. They got Nicholas Ray. I know, Nicholas Ray, the fella who directed Rebel Without a Cause, the king of teenage angst, the poet of juvenile delinquents. You see Jim Stark crying, "You're tearing me apart!" And you think, aye, that's the fella I want to direct the Sermon on the Mount. The man was an auteur, as the French say, a genuine artist, full of notions about himself, all about the psychology, the torment, the shadows. And MGM and Bronston handed him the New Testament in Technirama 70. This was like asking a Swiss watchmaker to fix a broken dam with a pair of tweezers. But Bronston had a writer, a fella named Philip Jordan, who was basically his script doctor, his fixer, and Jordan had a plan. The Gospels, see, they're a bit preachy. Not enough. Action. So Jordan decides to fix the Bible. He takes the story of Jesus and shoves 2 new plots right into the middle of it, kicking the furniture over. He decides the real story is the political one. It's about the Jewish rebellion against the Romans. So he makes Barabbas the fella the crowd frees instead of Jesus a main character. He's a zealot, a freedom fighter, a proper head the ball. And his best mate, his second in command in the revolution, Judas Iscariot, stop the lights. Judas isn't just a greedy Egypt anymore, he's a political idealist who betrays Jesus to try and force him to start a war. So you've got this arty, tormented director, you've got a producer building Rome in the middle of Spain, and you've got a script that's half Bible, half political thriller.
Are you kidding me?
All they needed now was the star, and they found him, a fella named Jeffrey Hunter. Now, Jeffrey Hunter was a handsome man, no doubt about it. He had eyes so blue you could drown in them, a square jaw. He was famous for playing cowboys, for being the young sidekick in The Searchers with John Wayne. He was a 1950s teen idol, a matinee star. He was, at the time, 33 years old, the Jesus year, which was probably the only thing on his CV that made any sense. But he was handsome, and Bronston and MGM, in their infinite arrogance, figured that was enough. They figured they could make him Jesus. It was a perfect plan. An arty director, a high-action script, a movie star Jesus, and the entire Spanish army as extras. A recipe for a reverent masterpiece. A grand start. A grand start.
Let's go!
The first job, turn Jeffrey Hunter, the fella from the cowboy pictures, into the King of Kings. How do you do that? Well, first you give him a wig. A truly spectacular, reddish blonde wig that sat on his head like a nervous, fluffy animal. It was so coiffed, so Hollywood. It didn't look like the hair of a carpenter from Nazareth, it looked like he'd just come from a very expensive salon in Beverly Hills. But the wig led to the first great carry-on. See, Jeffrey Hunter was a healthy fella, a man's man, and he had, as you'd expect, hair on his chest.
The question is, who cares?
And when they put him in his robes for the first camera tests, the director, Nicholas Ray, looked at him and just sighed. The problem? The fella's chest hair was dark brown, and his wig was reddish blonde. They didn't match. You can't have the savior of mankind with a two-tone dye job. It's just not on. So, in an act of pure, magnificent studio system Egyptry, they ordered Jeffrey Hunter to shave everything. His chest, his arms, his armpits. They gave Jesus a full body wax, so he'd be smooth, so he'd be, well, less of a fella and more of a plastic doll. A perfectly smooth, blue-eyed, all-American action figure. And that set the tone for everything.
Okay.
Nicholas Ray, the great artist, found himself completely lost. He wasn't directing a personal story, he was managing traffic. He was a general in Sam Bronston's army, and Bronston was building sets so big you could see them from space. They rebuilt the entire Temple of Jerusalem, they built the Hill of Calvary, they built entire villages, and they filled them with people. This brings us to the Sermon on the Mount, the most famous speech ever given, the spiritual core of the whole story. Jesus, on a hill, talking to the faithful. Bronston decided this had to be the biggest scene in the film. He wasn't gonna have a few dozen followers, he wasn't gonna have a few hundred. No, Samuel Bronston hired 7,000 extras. 7,000 people. Now, these weren't actors, these were by and large Spanish locals. Farmers, townspeople, and a good few soldiers from Franco's army, all dressed up in robes. And Nicholas Ray had to direct them. He had 5 cameras running at once. He built what was, at the time, the longest camera track in history, a massive railway line running all the way down the hill, just so the camera could glide majestically over the crowd. It was an absolute circus, pure devilment. You've got 7,000 Spanish extras, most of whom probably don't speak a word of English, all milling around. They're bored. It's hot. They're waiting all day for the shot. And up on the hill, there's Jeffrey Hunter. Poor, smooth-chested Jeffrey Hunter in his perfect wig. And he has to deliver the Beatitudes.
I see.
But he can't, because how do you get 7,000 extras to be quiet? How do you get them all to look, you know, blessed? You can't. They're chatting, they're having a smoke, they're eating their lunch. So what did they do? They hooked up a sound system. A massive, echoing public address system. And Jeffrey Hunter, he had to shout the Sermon on the Mount through a microphone. Blessed are the poor in spirit. For theirs is the kingdom of heaven. It wasn't a sermon, it was a political rally. It was a fella at a football match telling everyone to move down the stands. And poor Nicholas Ray, the author, he's watching this pageant, this logistical nightmare, and he's trying to find the truth of the scene. He's trying to get a close-up of a single tear-filled eye, and just out of frame, there are 7,000 Spaniards wondering when they're gonna get paid. It was a dog's dinner. While Ray was trying to find art in the middle of a stampede, the writer, Philip Jordan, was making sure his action movie was getting made. They cast the revolutionaries. For Barabbas, the tough-as-nails zealot, they got a fella named Harry Gardino, a New Yorker, a fella with an accent you could cut glass with, so you have this biblical epic. Everyone's talking in that grand, "Verily I say unto thee," Hollywood Bible voice. And then in storms Barabbas, sounding like he's just stepped out of a cab in Brooklyn. "Hey, you guys, we're gonna fight des Romans! Forget the it!" It's baffling. And for Judas, the tragic, tormented Judas, they got rip-torn. Aye, rip-torn. One of the most intense head the balls in Hollywood history. A fella who was pure, vibrating, chaotic energy. And they cast him as the neurotic, politically motivated disciple. So the scenes that are meant to be about Jesus, they're constantly being stolen. Jesus is over here, talking about peace and love, looking serene and slightly lost. And just off camera, you've got Rip Torn, bug-eyed and twitching, talking to Harry Gardino from Brooklyn about starting a war. Jesus isn't even the main character in his own film. He's the quiet fella in the corner, while the real movie, a mad political thriller, happens all around him.
Say what?
He's on screen for less than half the film. Less than half. It was an absolute hames. The arrogance of it. The studio was so convinced that epic just meant big that they forgot to include the story. They forgot to include the point. Nicholas Ray, to his credit, tried. He staged some beautiful, shadowy, tormented scenes. He filmed the crucifixion with a camera mounted on top of the cross looking down, which was a hell of a shot. He was trying to make Rebel Without a God, but Bronston and MGM, they were making a poster, they were making a product, and the final act of Butchery, the ultimate carry-on. The film is finished. They look at the final cut, and the studio bosses, they have a problem. Jeffrey Hunter, he sounds weak. He's got a fine, normal voice, but it's not God.
Oh, God.
It's not the booming, reverent voice of the Bible they wanted. It's just a fella from a cowboy picture. So they fired his voice. I'm not joking. They finished the entire film, and then they told their star, the man who played Jesus Christ, that his voice wasn't good enough. They hired an English theatre actor, a fella named Michael Hordern, to come into a dark room and redub every single one of Jeffrey Hunter's lines. Every word. So when you watch the film, you're watching Jeffrey Hunter's blue-eyed, clean-shaven face. And you're hearing the deep, plummy, terribly British tones of another man entirely. It's weird. It's like watching a badly dubbed Italian movie. The final act of turning the Son of God into a ventriloquist's dummy. And then, just to stick the knife in, Nicholas Ray's bleak, arty ending where Jesus just leaves the disciples on a mountain that was thrown in the bin. Instead, the studio shot a new ending. A big, cheesy, glorious Technicolor shot of Jesus, resurrected, walking on a beach. And his shadow forms a massive cross on the sand, just in case you didn't get it. Just in case the 7,000 extras, the booming voice, and the wig didn't tip you off that this was a religious picture. Stop the lights. The film comes out in 1961, and the critics, they were not kind. They saw exactly what it was. They saw the arrogance, they saw the bloat, they saw the Brooklyn Barabbas, and they saw Jeffrey Hunter, this beautiful, blue-eyed 33-year-old matinee idol, looking less like the savior and more like a teenager. And some smart aleck critic, and God bless him, whoever he was, wrote the line that killed the film. He called it, "I was a teenage Jesus." It was perfect. It was brutal, and it stuck. It was the carry-on heard round the world. The film was no longer King of Kings. It was, I was a teenage Jesus. So, did it destroy the studio? Did it fail? Here's the truly mad part. The film was a hit. A massive box office success.
Wait, what?
All that money, all that arrogance, all that cynical packaging, it worked. The public, God love 'em, flocked to see it. They saw the posters, they heard the booming music, and they went, it made a fortune, but it wasn't Ben-Hur. It didn't save the studio. Not really. It just paid the bills. It was a success, but a hollow one. It was a success that proved the studio's worst instincts were right. It taught them that you could take a sacred story, strip mine it for parts, cast a teen idol, hire a director who was wrong for the job, and then dub the whole thing with a British fella. And you'd still make money. Was it a masterpiece? Not a bit of it. It was a product. A cynical, bloated, beautiful, misbegotten, arrogant product. It wasn't a film about Jesus, it was a film about MGM's bank balance. It's a perfect monument to the dying days of the studio system. A war against common sense, where the first casualty was the Bible itself. The film wasn't a spiritual journey, it was a multi-million-dollar monument to pure Egyptry. As me old fella used to say, just because you put a pig in a silk waistcoat doesn't make him a gentleman. And this was one hell of a pig. And that's the dirt from the cutting room floor. Right, go on now, we are done.